I saw them switch folder. 5 words, whispered by a child. 5 words that stopped the vampire king from signing away his empire and expose a betrayal worth $9 billion. But here's what makes this story unforgettable. That little girl was not meant to exist in his world. She was Sheila Bryson, daughter of a maid, sitting silently in a marble hallway, trying not to breathe too loud. Invisible. And those 2 men in $1,000 suits? They swapped the documents right in front of her. They never looked down. They thought the hallway was empty. They forgot that invisible doesn't mean blind. This is the story of how the smallest witness in Crestmore Tower became the one person who could shatter a perfect lie. How a whispered truth from a scared child saved an ancient being from his own blindness. And how one moment of courage didn't just expose a $9 billion fraud. It woke up a king who'd been asleep for 1,000 years. Stay with me, because what happens next will show you that power isn't about being the strongest voice in the room. Sometimes, it's about being brave enough to speak when everyone thinks you don't matter. Before we continue, let us know in the comment section what time it is and where you are watching from. And remember to like and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of the story. Now, let's continue. Crestmore Tower didn't touch the sky. It carved through it. 73 floors of black glass and polished steel, standing in the heart of the financial district like a blade. Inside, everything gleamed. Marble floors so smooth they reflected the ceiling lights like still water. Chrome elevator doors that opened without a sound. The air itself felt expensive, filtered and climate-controlled to an exact 68 degrees year-round. No one raised their voice here. No one needed to. Power didn't shout in Crestmore Holdings. It whispered. Jennifer Bryson had worked these floors for 6 years. She knew every corner, every executive bathroom, every hidden service hallway. She moved through the tower the way good cleaning staff always did, efficiently, quietly, invisibly. Her uniform was pressed. Her cart was organized. Her daughter sat beside it on a small folding stool, hands folded in her lap, pink dress smoothed down over her knees. "Remember what I told you," Jennifer had said that morning, kneeling down to meet Sheila's wide brown eyes. "We're guests in their world. We don't touch what isn't ours. We don't speak unless spoken to. And no matter what you see, baby, you tell the truth. Always. The truth is a clean path, even in a dark world." Sheila had nodded solemnly. She was 5, but she understood. Mama's rules weren't suggestions. Now she sat outside the executive lounge on the 52nd floor, trying to be smaller than she already was. Mama was inside, cleaning the conference room where the important people met. Sheila could hear the hum of the vacuum, steady and rhythmic. She swung her legs just a little, careful not to let her shoes scuff the marble. She'd never been to the tower before. Mama's babysitter had canceled last minute, and there was no one else. Just today, Mama had promised. Just sit still and stay quiet. Pretend you're a mouse. But Sheila didn't feel like a mouse. She felt like she was sitting inside a giant's house. Everything was too big, too shiny, too cold. And somewhere up above, in the highest office with windows that looked out over the whole city, was him, Mr. Crestmore. Sheila had heard the other cleaning ladies talk about him in the break room. They said he never smiled, never aged, that his eyes were pale like frost, and that when he looked at you, he looked through you, like you were made of glass. One of the ladies, Miss Rosa, had whispered that he wasn't human, that he was something old, something that didn't sleep. Sheila pulled her knees up to her chest and hugged them tight. She imagined him now, tall and terrible, dressed in a black suit with gold on the edges, hair like ice, walking down these silent hallways while everyone stepped aside. A beautiful monster in a building made of mirrors. She shivered and stayed very, very still. The hallway had been empty for 20 minutes. Sheila had counted. She'd moved from her stool to sit cross-legged beside a massive potted plant, some kind of tropical thing with broad, waxy leaves that made her feel hidden. Safe. Mama was still vacuuming in the conference room. The sound was distant now, muffled through thick walls and heavy doors. Then she heard footsteps. Fast ones. Not the slow, confident click of expensive shoes she'd heard all morning. These were quick.
Urgent.
2 sets, moving in sync. Sheila pressed herself closer to the planter, peering through the leaves. 2 men rounded the corner. Both wore dark suits that looked like they cost more than Mama's car. One was older, gray at the temples, with a thin face and wire-rimmed glasses. The other was younger, broad-shouldered, with slicked-back hair and a jawline sharp enough to cut. They were breathing hard, like they'd been running. The older one, she'd later learn his name was Henry Walker, kept glancing over his shoulder. His hand shook as he pulled a leather briefcase up onto a narrow console table that stood against the wall. "Are you sure no one's here?" the younger one hissed. Gabriel Lawson, Vice President of Acquisitions. A man who smiled at investors and crushed competitors without blinking. "I'm sure," Henry snapped, fumbling with the briefcase latches. Security's sweep confirmed it. The executive floor's clear until the signing at 3. "We've got 8 minutes. Sheila held her breath. Henry popped the briefcase open and pulled out 2 folders. One was thick, bound with a crimson ribbon and stamped with gold lettering she couldn't read from where she sat. Official. Important. The other folder was thinner, pale cream-colored, and looked almost identical, but not quite. "This is insane," Gabriel muttered, running a hand through his hair. "If he finds out." "He won't." Henry's voice was cold now. Steady. He placed the crimson folder into the briefcase and pulled out the pale one, setting it on top of the stack of documents already arranged on the table. "He'll sign it." The king never checks the small details. He hasn't in decades. He's too far above it all. Too bored. Gabriel laughed, but it sounded wrong. Nervous. $9 billion isn't a small detail. It is to him. Henry closed the briefcase with a decisive snap. By the time anyone notices, the funds will have cleared, the acquisition will collapse, and Hartfield Corp will have bought up the pieces for pennies. We'll be in Geneva living like kings ourselves. And Crestmore? Henry shrugged. Crestmore will survive. It always does. Just with new management. They straightened their ties. Adjusted their cuffs. Gabriel picked up the briefcase. Henry smoothed down the forged documents on the console table, arranging them just so, like a trap being set. Then they turned and walked away, shoes clicking in perfect rhythm, voices fading down the hall. Sheila didn't move. Her heart was hammering so loud, she thought they might hear it and come back. But they didn't. They were already gone, disappearing around the corner toward the elevators, laughing about something she couldn't hear. She stared at the pale folder sitting on the table. She didn't understand all the words they'd said, but she understood enough. They'd switched something. Something important. Something that belonged to Mr. Crestmore, the man everyone feared, the one Mama said owned this entire building and maybe half the city. And they'd done it because they thought no one was watching. Sheila's stomach twisted. Mama's voice echoed in her head. The truth is a clean path, even in a dark world. She didn't know what to do. But she knew, with a certainty that made her hands tremble, that what she'd just seen was very, very wrong. The elevator doors opened without a sound. Vorian Crestmore stepped out onto the 52nd floor at exactly 2:47 p.m. He moved like winter itself, silent, inevitable, beautiful in a way that made you forget to breathe. His suit was black velvet, tailored to perfection, with gold embroidery tracing the lapels and cuffs in patterns that belonged to a different century. His hair, platinum blonde and glacial, was pulled back in a half bun that somehow made him look both regal and predatory. Behind him, 2 men in dark suits followed at a respectful distance. Security. Silent. Unnecessary, really, but appearance mattered in the mortal world. Vorian's pale eyes scanned the hallway with the casual disinterest of someone who had seen 1,000 hallways just like it. The signing was in 12 minutes. The acquisition documents were already prepared on the executive table. 30 years of careful planning, countless meetings, billions of dollars in motion, all culminating in a signature. His signature. Routine. Boring. He was halfway down the hall when he felt it. A gaze. Not the usual kind. Not the nervous glances of employees who scattered when he passed, or the calculated stares of executives trying to read him. This was different. Steady. Unblinking. Heavy with something he hadn't felt in decades. Fear. Yes. But also intent. He stopped. His security detail stopped behind him, confused but silent. Vorian turned his head slowly, following the pull of that gaze like a compass needle finding north. And there, tucked beside a potted plant near the console table, sat a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 5. Pink dress. Brown hair pulled back in 2 small ponytails. Hands clutching her knees. She was staring at him with eyes so wide he could see the white all around the irises. She should have looked away. Everyone looked away. She didn't. Something ancient stirred in Vorian's chest, something he'd long since buried under centuries of detachment and cold efficiency. Curiosity, maybe. Or recognition. The kind you feel when you see someone standing at a crossroads, holding something fragile and critical, and you know, somehow, that what happens next matters. He moved toward her. His security detail exchanged glances, but stayed back. Vorian stopped 3 feet away, towering over the child like a marble statue come to life. She was trembling now, but she still hadn't looked away. He could hear her heartbeat, rabbiting, frantic, alive in a way that mortal hearts always were. And then, on pure instinct he didn't bother to question, Vorian Crestmore knelt. The velvet of his jacket whispered against the marble floor. His pale eyes leveled with hers. Up close, he could see the tears pooling at the corners of her lashes, the way her breath hitched in her throat. "What is your name?" His voice was low, soft, the kind of tone you'd use with something wild and skittish. "Sheila," she whispered. "Sheila." He repeated it, tasting the syllables. "Why are you looking at me like that?" Her lips trembled. She glanced past him, toward the console table where the pale folder still sat, perfectly arranged. Then back to him. She swallowed hard. And then, in a voice barely louder than a breath, she said the 5 words that would shatter everything. "I saw them, switch folder." Vorian went very, very still. The world around him seemed to slow, the hum of the air conditioning, the distant murmur of voices from another floor, the rhythm of her heartbeat. All of it faded into background noise. He leaned forward just an inch. "Say that again." Sheila's voice shook, but she didn't look away. "I saw them, switch folder. The men in the suits. They took the red one and put a different one there." She pointed, her small finger aimed directly at the documents on the console table. They said you wouldn't check." For the first time in 100 years, Vorian Crestmore felt the cold grip of something he'd almost forgotten. Vulnerability. He rose slowly, his eyes never leaving the folder. And behind him, the 2 security guards tensed, sensing the shift in the air. The king had just woken up. Vorian didn't move toward the folder. Not yet. Instead, he turned back to the child, still kneeling, and when he spoke again his voice was velvet over steel. "Sheila, I need you to tell me exactly what you saw. Can you do that?" She nodded, her small hands twisting together in her lap. "How many men?" 2. "Describe them." She took a shaky breath. One was old. He had gray hair and glasses. Skinny. The other one was big. Dark hair slicked back. They were in a hurry. Vorian's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Henry Walker. Gabriel Lawson. Senior executives. Men he'd trusted with portions of his empire for over a decade. What did they do? They opened a briefcase. The old one took out a folder with a red ribbon and gold writing. Then he put a different folder on the table. A pale one. It looked almost the same, but not really. Vorian's eyes flicked to the console table. The acquisition documents. The final package for the Meridian Global deal. The most critical expansion Crestmore Holdings had orchestrated in 30 years. $9 billion in structured assets. Partnerships across 4 continents. Contracts that would take effect the moment his signature touched paper. If those documents had been altered, did they say anything? His voice was still soft, but there was a razor's edge beneath it now. Sheila nodded quickly. The old one said, "He'll sign it." The king never checks the small details. And the big one asked about $9 billion, and the old one said it didn't matter, because you'd be too bored to notice. Silence. Vorian stared at her, his pale eyes unblinking, and for just a moment Sheila saw something flicker across his face. Not anger, not yet, but something colder.
Deeper. Shock.
He had ruled in shadows for over a millennium. He had built empires, toppled dynasties, orchestrated the rise and fall of nations from boardrooms just like this one. He had seen betrayal in every form mortals could conjure. But this was breathtaking in its audacity. They hadn't just committed fraud. They had gambled on his apathy, on the assumption that his immortal boredom had made him lazy.
Blind.
That the vampire king had become so detached from his own empire that he would sign away billions without a second glance. And the worst part? They'd been right to think it. Until now. Vorian rose to his full height, and the temperature in the hallway seemed to drop 5 degrees. His face was a porcelain mask, beautiful, flawless, and utterly devoid of warmth. He touched 2 fingers to the small device hidden behind his ear, a motion so subtle Sheila almost missed it. When he spoke, his voice was low and laced with a quiet, lethal authority. Marcus. Initiate full lockdown. Executive floor. No one enters or leaves. I want surveillance footage from hallway 52C pulled immediately. Timeline. The last 30 minutes. And locate Henry Walker and Gabriel Lawson.
Now.
A pause. Then even softer. Consider this a code black. He released the device and turned his gaze back to the console table, stepping toward it with a slow, deliberate grace of a predator circling wounded prey. He didn't touch the folder yet. He simply stood over it, hands clasped behind his back, studying it the way a surgeon might study a malignant growth. Behind him, his security detail moved into position, flanking the hallway exits. Somewhere in the building, alarms were being triggered silently. Elevator access was being restricted. Digital locks were engaging. Crestmore Tower was sealing itself. Vorian looked down at the pale folder, so carefully placed, so perfectly innocuous, and felt something he hadn't experienced in centuries. Fury. Not the hot, reckless kind. The cold kind. The kind that moved with precision. The kind that didn't forgive. He turned back to Sheila, who was still sitting beside the planter, watching him with wide, frightened eyes. And for the first time in decades, Vorian Crestmore smiled. It was a small smile.
Thin.
Sharp as a blade. You, he said quietly, may have just saved thousands of lives, little one. Then he straightened his cuffs, turned on his heel, and walked toward the executive conference room like a king preparing for war. Jennifer Bryson heard the commotion before she saw it. She'd been finishing the last corner of the conference room, coiling the vacuum cord with practiced efficiency when the hallway outside suddenly flooded with voices. Security personnel.
Rapid forward steps.
The low crackle of radios. Her blood went cold.
Sheila.
She abandoned the vacuum and rushed into the hallway, her heart hammering against her ribs. The scene that greeted her made her stomach drop. For security guards stood at attention near the elevator bank. 2 more flanked the console table. And there, in the center of it all, stood Vorian Crestmore himself, tall, pale, terrifying, with her daughter still sitting on the floor beside the potted plant. Sheila. Jennifer's voice cracked as she rushed forward. Baby, what did you, Mr. Crestmore? I'm so sorry. She wasn't supposed to. Vorian raised one hand. The gesture was small, effortless, but it stopped Jennifer mid-sentence like she'd hit an invisible wall. He turned to face her, and the look in his pale eyes was so intense, so utterly commanding, that she forgot how to breathe. "Your daughter," he said, his voice quiet and edged with something she couldn't name, "has protected this empire." Jennifer blinked. What? She witnessed a crime. She reported it to me. And because of her courage, a catastrophic betrayal has been prevented. He glanced down at Sheila, who was now standing, clutching the edge of her pink dress. "You should be very proud, Mrs. Bryson." Jennifer's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Before she could process what was happening, one of the security guards approached with a tablet.
"Sir."
"Footage is ready." Vorian took the device without a word and turned it so the screen faced him. Jennifer moved closer, hesitant, and he tilted it slightly so she could see. The video was crystal clear. Timestamp: 2:32 p.m. Hallway 52C. Two men in expensive suits entered the frame, Henry Walker and Gabriel Lawson. Jennifer recognized them immediately. She'd cleaned Mr. Walker's office 100 times. He always left coffee rings on his desk. On screen, Walker glanced around nervously, then opened a briefcase on the console table. He pulled out a crimson ribbon folder and swapped it with a pale cream one, his hands moving quickly, precisely. Lawson stood watch, shoulders tense. Then Walker's voice came through, tinny but clear on the tablet speaker. "He'll sign it. The king never checks the small details." Lawson's response: $9 billion isn't a small detail. Walker's cold laugh: "It is to him." Jennifer felt the air leave her lungs. Vorian's expression didn't change, but his finger tapped the screen, pausing the video on a freeze frame of Walker sealing the briefcase, a smug smile on his face. "Devastating clarity," Vorian murmured. He handed the tablet back to the guard. "Pull the forged documents. I want a full forensic comparison with the originals within the hour. Contact legal. Contact the board. And contact the authorities." "Yes, sir." Vorian turned, and for the first time Jennifer saw the true weight of his fury. It wasn't loud. It wasn't hot. It was glacial. Absolute. He touched the comm device behind his ear. "Marcus, I want Henry Walker and Gabriel Lawson detained. Immediately. Executive conference room. A full restraint protocols." A pause. Then his voice dropped to a low snarl, and the words came out like a death sentence. "Have them removed.
Permanently."
This is an act of war against Crestmore Holdings. The security team moved as one, disappearing down the hallway with military precision. Minutes later, Jennifer watched through the glass walls of the corridor as Henry Walker and Gabriel Lawson were escorted out of a meeting room in handcuffs. Walker's face was ashen. Lawson was shouting, his voice muffled but frantic, gesturing wildly. Neither of them looked remotely smug anymore. They were walked past the executive floor, past the rows of stunned employees who'd begun to gather, past the woman in the cleaning uniform and the little girl in the pink dress. Lawson's eyes locked on Sheila for just a moment. And then he was gone. Vorian stood in the center of the hallway, hands clasped behind his back, watching the elevator doors close on the two men who had tried to destroy him. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm again. Controlled. "Mrs. Bryson." Jennifer straightened. "Yes, sir?" He turned to face her fully, and this time, there was something almost soft in his gaze. "Take your daughter home. Stay there for the rest of the week. Paid, of course." He paused. "We will speak again very soon. You have my word." Jennifer nodded, unable to find her voice. Vorian looked down at Sheila one last time. "Thank you," he said quietly. And then he walked away, his black velvet jacket disappearing around the corner, leaving only silence in his wake. The penthouse occupied the entire 73rd floor. Vorian stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows, hands in his pockets, watching the city lights flicker and fade as dawn crept across the horizon. He'd sent Jennifer and Sheila home hours ago with a handwritten commendation, something he hadn't done in 30 years, and a promise that he would speak with them personally within the week. The building was silent now. Empty. The board had been briefed. Legal was handling the criminal filings. The forged documents had been incinerated, the originals secured. Henry Walker and Gabriel Lawson were in federal custody, their careers destroyed, their reputations ashes.
Swift. Clean.
Efficient. Exactly the way he'd always operated. And yet, Vorian tilted his head, watching the sun break over the skyline. A wash of gold and amber spilling across steel and glass. He'd seen this view 1,000 times. 10,000. Sunrise after sunrise, century after century, and each one bled into the next until they became a single, unending moment of sameness. Beautiful. Meaningless. He exhaled slowly, his breath fogging the glass for just a moment before disappearing. He should have caught it. That was the truth that had been gnawing at him since the moment Sheila Bryson whispered those 5 words. He should have seen the betrayal coming. Should have noticed the signs. Walker's nervous energy in recent meetings, Lawson's carefully worded questions about succession protocols, the subtle shifts in loyalty that any competent ruler would have detected. But he hadn't. Because he hadn't been looking. Not really. Vorian turned away from the window and moved to the leather chair positioned near the center of the room. He sank into it, elbows on his knees, fingers steepled beneath his chin. For centuries, he had prided himself on his control, his precision, his ability to see patterns in chaos, to manipulate markets and men with equal ease. He had built Crestmore Holdings into a financial empire that spanned continents, wielding power most mortals couldn't even comprehend. And he had done it all from a place of perfect, icy detachment. Mortals were temporary, fleeting. Their lives were mayfly flickers against the vast stretch of his existence. He had learned long ago not to invest too deeply in them, not emotionally anyway.
It was easier that way. Cleaner.
They came. They worked. They aged. They died. And he remained. But somewhere along the way, that detachment had calcified into blindness. He stopped seeing them as people. Stopped noticing the woman who polished his floors every night with quiet pride. Stopped acknowledging the security guard who stood outside his office for 12-hour shifts without complaint. Stopped recognizing that behind every insignificant role was a soul, fragile, mortal, and capable of extraordinary things. Like courage. Like truth. A 5-year-old girl in a pink dress had seen what he could not. She had been invisible to the men who betrayed him, invisible to the system he had built. And in her invisibility, she had become the only witness, the only one brave enough to speak. She had saved him, not his empire, not his wealth, him. Vorian leaned back in the chair, his pale eyes fixed on the ceiling. He felt something shift inside his chest, something old and dormant, stirring after centuries of sleep. Purpose. Not the empty pursuit of more. Not the mechanical expansion of profit margins and market share. But something deeper. Something that had been missing since he could remember. The desire to see again. To lead not as a distant, untouchable king, but as someone who understood that the strength of an empire wasn't measured in billions. It was measured in the trust of those who built it, the loyalty of those who believed in it, the courage of those brave enough to protect it, even when they had no reason to, especially then. Vorian rose from the chair, moving back to the window as the sun climbed higher, bathing the city in light. His ennui was over. He would not rule from the shadows anymore. He would not build power on the assumption that mortals were beneath his notice. He would do better. For Sheila. For Jennifer. For every person in this building who had been invisible for too long. "I've been asleep," he murmured to the empty room. And then, quieter still, "Not anymore." The boardroom had never been so silent. Vorian stood at the head of the table, his platinum hair unbound and falling past his shoulders like a sheet of ice. He wore no jacket today, just a black shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows, the gold cufflinks glinting under the recessed lighting. His expression was severe, unreadable. Around a table sat 12 of the most powerful executives in global finance. Men and women who controlled billions, who negotiated with governments, who moved markets with a single phone call. Not one of them had spoken since he'd begun. "I will say this once," Vorian said, his voice low and cold. "So, I suggest you listen carefully." He placed both hands on the table, leaning forward. 3 days ago, 2 senior executives of this company attempted to commit a $9 billion fraud. They swapped confidential acquisition documents with forgeries designed to collapse the Meridian deal, destabilize our asset holdings, and funnel the resulting chaos into the hands of a competitor. A few board members shifted uncomfortably. Others stared, stone-faced. They succeeded in placing the forged documents. They were minutes away from watching me sign them. He paused, letting the weight of that settle. "And do you know why they believed they would succeed?" No one answered. "Because they assumed I wouldn't check. That I was too detached, too bored, too far removed from the operations of my own empire to notice the details." His pale eyes swept the room like a blade. And they were right to assume it. One of the board members, a silver-haired woman named Catherine Hale, cleared her throat. "Vorian, with all due respect." "I'm not finished." She closed her mouth. This fraud was not stopped by our security protocols. It was not stopped by our internal audits or our compliance systems or any of the expensive mechanisms we have in place to protect this company. He straightened, his voice dropping to something quieter,
Sharper.
It was stopped by a 5-year-old girl, the daughter of a cleaning staff member, a child who had the courage to tell the truth when no one else even saw the lie. The room was deathly still. Her name is Sheila Bryson, and she saved this empire because she was invisible to the men who betrayed me, invisible to a system we have built that treats support staff as furniture, as background noise, as insignificant. Vorian's jaw tightened. That ends today. He moved around the table slowly, his footsteps echoing on the polished floor. "I am calling for an immediate, comprehensive overhaul of Crestmore Holdings' corporate culture. Every department, every floor, every policy." He stopped, turning to face them. "We will implement transparency standards across all executive decisions. We will establish respect protocols that apply to every employee, from janitorial staff to the C-suite. We will create pathways for recognition, promotion, and voice for those who have been ignored." Catherine leaned forward. "Vorian, that's a massive undertaking. The cost alone." "I don't care about the cost." His voice was ice. "I care about the integrity of this institution. And if you cannot see the value in that, Catherine, then you are welcome to resign." She sat back, silent. Vorian returned to the head of the table. "Jennifer Bryson, Sheila's mother, has worked for this company for 6 years. She has been meticulous, loyal, and invisible. That changes now." He pulled a folder from the table and opened it. "Effective immediately, Mrs. Bryson will be offered an executive-level position in operations management. Her salary will be tripled, full benefits, stock options, and her daughter, Sheila, will receive a fully funded scholarship, education through university, all expenses covered." He closed the folder and looked up. "This is not charity. This is justice. And it is the new standard of loyalty at Crestmore Holdings. We reward truth. We reward courage. And we see our people." One of the younger board members, a man named David Ortiz, nodded slowly. I think that's the right move, Vorian." "I'm not asking for your approval, David." Vorian's tone was calm, but absolute. "I am telling you how this company will operate moving forward. If that doesn't align with your vision, the door is behind you." No one moved. Vorian straightened his cuffs, his expression softening just a fraction. "We were blind. All of us. And it almost cost us everything. He looked each of them in the eye. That will not happen again. He turned toward the door, then paused. Meeting adjourned. I expect full implementation plans on my desk by Monday. And with that, the Vampire King walked out, leaving his board in stunned, reverent silence. Jennifer Bryson had never been inside Vorian Crestmore's private office before. It was nothing like she'd imagined. No cold marble or imposing desk. Just floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a few carefully chosen pieces of furniture, and shelves lined with books that looked older than the building itself. Vorian stood by the window when they entered, hands clasped behind his back. He turned as the door closed, and his pale eyes settled on Sheila, who stood beside her mother in a yellow sundress, her hand tucked into Jennifer's. Mrs. Bryson. Sheila. Thank you for coming. Jennifer nodded, still processing everything that had happened in the last 72 hours. The promotion, the salary, the scholarship. It felt like a dream she was afraid to wake from. Vorian moved closer, then lowered himself into a chair, so he was closer to Sheila's height. Sheila, I wanted to speak with you one more time. To thank you properly. His voice was softer than Jennifer had ever heard it. What you did, telling me the truth when you were scared, that took extraordinary courage. Because of you, thousands of people still have their jobs. Families still have their homes. You saved more than you know. Sheila looked up at him with those wide brown eyes, and for a moment she said nothing. Then, in that fearless way only children possess, she tilted her head and asked, "Why don't you smile?" Vorian blinked. You're really important, Sheila continued, her small voice filling the quiet office. Everyone's scared of you, but you always look sad, like you're waiting for something that's never going to come. She paused. Are you bored? Jennifer's hand tightened on her daughter's shoulder. Sheila. But Vorian raised a hand gently, his gaze never leaving the child's face. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, really looked. At the innocence, the clarity, the way she saw straight through the centuries of armor he'd built around himself. And then, slowly, he smiled. It was small, fragile even, but real. Yes, little one, he said quietly. I had been bored for a very, very long time. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He opened it carefully, revealing a delicate silver locket shaped like a star, suspended on a fine chain. The craftsmanship was exquisite, antique, clearly, with tiny engravings along the edges that caught the light. But you gave me something I hadn't felt in centuries. He lifted the locket from the box and held it out to her. You gave me something new to wait for. A better tomorrow. Sheila's eyes went wide. For me? For you. She took it carefully, cradling it in her small hands like it was made of glass. Vorian fastened the chain around her neck, his pale fingers impossibly gentle. This star, he said, is to remind you that even the smallest light can pierce the greatest darkness. You did that for me, Sheila. You reminded a very old king that there are still things worth protecting, worth fighting for. Sheila touched the star, her face glowing with quiet wonder. Then she looked up at him and said simply, You should smile more. It makes you look nice. Vorian let out a breath that might have been a laugh. I will try, he promised. Jennifer felt tears prick her eyes as she watched her daughter, her brave, honest, impossible daughter, stand fearlessly before one of the most powerful men in the world and make him human again. Vorian rose, extending a hand to Jennifer. Thank you, Mrs. Bryson, for raising someone so remarkable. Jennifer shook his hand, her voice thick. Thank you, Mr. Crestmore, for seeing her. He nodded, and as they left, Sheila turned back one last time, waving. Vorian raised his hand in return, that small, fragile smile still on his face. 1 year later, Crestmore Holdings was unrecognizable, not in structure, The tower still stood 73 floors tall, black glass cutting through the skyline. Not in profit, the company had posted record earnings for 3 consecutive quarters. But in soul, employees no longer whispered nervously in the hallways. The cafeteria buzzed with conversation. Support staff wore their uniforms with pride. Promotions were earned on merit, not tenure. Transparency reports were published quarterly. And at the center of it all stood Vorian Crestmore, still pale, still imposing, still feared. But now also respected. The annual company celebration was held on the sprawling lawn behind the tower, something Vorian had never done before. Thousands of employees and their families gathered under white tents, children running between tables, laughter rising into the summer air. Vorian stood on a small stage, microphone in hand, his platinum hair pulled back, his black suit traded for something softer, charcoal gray, no tie. He looked almost approachable. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice carrying across the crowd. A year ago, this company faced a crisis. Not a financial one, though it nearly became that. A moral one. The crowd quieted. We had built an empire on efficiency and profit, but we had forgotten the people who made it possible. We had become blind to the truth that power without integrity is simply tyranny in expensive clothing. He paused, scanning the faces before him. That changed because one person, one child, had the courage to speak the truth when it mattered most. And because of her, we remembered what we were supposed to be. Applause rippled through the crowd. Vorian stepped down from the stage, moving through the gathering with an ease that would have been impossible a year ago. Employees greeted him,
shook his hand,
introduced him to their children. And then he saw her. Jennifer Bryson stood near one of the refreshment tables, dressed in a tailored navy suit, her hair styled professionally. She looked confident, radiant. She was deep in conversation with 2 other executives, laughing at something one of them said. Beside her, holding a plate of cookies, was Sheila. She wore a white dress and the silver star locket, gleaming against her collarbone. When she saw Vorian, her face lit up. "Mr. Crestmore." She abandoned her plate and ran toward him, weaving between adults with the fearless energy only children possess. Vorian stopped, and before he could say a word, Sheila wrapped her arms around his leg and squeezed. The crowd around them paused, watching. Vorian looked down at the little girl clinging to him, and something inside his chest, something that had been cold and dormant for centuries, warmed. He knelt down just as he had a year ago in that marble hallway. "Hello, little one." "I like your party," Sheila said, grinning. "There's a bounce house."
I'm glad.
He smiled, genuinely, easily. "You know, you changed my life, Sheila." She tilted her head. "I did. You did. You showed the king what was truly worth ruling." He touched the star around her neck gently. "Not numbers. Not power.
People. Trust.
Truth." Sheila beamed. Jennifer approached, resting a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "She's been talking about this all week." Vorian rose, meeting Jennifer's eyes. "She should. She's the reason we're all here." Jennifer smiled, tears glistening. "Thank you. For everything." Vorian nodded, then looked back at Sheila. "Remember what I told you," he said softly. "Even the smallest light can pierce the greatest darkness." Sheila nodded solemnly. Then she hugged him again, quick and fierce, before running back toward the bounce house. Vorian watched her go, his hands in his pockets, the summer sun warm on his face. For the first time in a millennium, he felt something he'd thought lost forever.
Peace.
The greatest fortune, he realized, was never built on gold. It was built on the trust of those you protect. And he would spend the rest of his endless days proving he was worthy of it. If this story pulled you in, like this video if you believe the smallest voices deserve to be heard. Share it with someone who needs to remember that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about speaking up even when you're scared. And subscribe so you never miss stories that remind you why truth, loyalty, Love and seeing people for who they really are will always matter more than power.